Hi, I'm Alison from the community team at the Heath Business and Technical Park in Runcorn, and I'm now going to read to you Chapter 7 of the Bunjee Venture, written by Stan McMurtry. Now, if you've listened to the first 6 chapters, you will realise that 2 children, Karen and Andy, have gone back in time to look for their father because he invented a time machine which they discovered had broken. So they rebuilt it and now they've gone back to find him. Unfortunately, just when they discovered he was well and alive, a pterodactyl had scooped them up as its lunch and deposited them in a very high up nest, which is halfway down a cliff. And in order to save themselves, they'd had to throw the pterodactyl's eggs out of the nest to distract the pterodactyl. The pterodactyl had then rescued the eggs, crashed into the wall and spiralled into the river below. So here we go. Chapter 7. It was midday. The sky was now a harsh golden yellow except for the sun, which hung in the centre, white like the open door of a furnace. The little fluffy clouds had long since scurried away over the horizon as though trying to get away from the heat. The rocky face of the cliff sucked in the hot rays of the sun and hoarded them until its surface was almost impossible to touch. A tiny patch of shadow was cast by the outer edge of the nest, barely covering the 2 children huddled together away from the glare. Andy had draped his jacket between the branches of the nest, which helped to create a little more shade. But it was still unbearably hot and they were totally exhausted. They'd been up on the ledge now for over 24 hours. The fight with the pterodactyl had weakened them enough, but having to endure a long freezing cold night and then a blisteringly hot morning had left them physically and emotionally drained. Things are looking pretty bad for us, Andy thought to himself gloomily. The flask of coffee and the bottle of lemonade were now empty, and it was some hours since they'd had anything to drink at all. He ran his tongue over his lips and glanced over at his sister. She seemed to be fast asleep. Her cardigan was pulled over her head to protect her from the sun, and she lay pressed flat into the shadow, breathing heavily. He leant forward and brushed away 2 brightly coloured insects which buzzed irritatingly around her head. Since the pterodactyl had gone, these small insects had increased in numbers. They were about the size of a common house blue bottle, but they had kingfisher blue bodies and yellow wings, and boy did they sting. Both children were now covered with small, red, itchy spots where the insects had settled. He swatted another one from his arm and frowned. If it wasn't for me, none of this would have happened, he thought. Why did I have to insist on building another time machine and coming back to this terrible part of history? Well, their position looked hopeless. Here they were, stuck, miles up an unclimbable cliff. They didn't know which way to go to look for their father, and even if they found him, they might not be able to locate the time machine now. Oh dear, if only we hadn't become unconscious when the pterodactyl picked us up, he thought. Then we might just have had a clue as to which way to go. Oh, anyway, what's the use? We'll never be able to get down off this ledge. He rolled over onto his back and shielded his eyes with his arm. Well, there is one good thing, I suppose, about all this, he muttered to himself. At least we know that Daddy did in fact travel back in time and that he is safe and well. So if we could only get down from this rotten cliff. I wonder now, if we get all of our clothes and if we tied them all together, they might just reach down far enough for us to... Andy frowned. His train of thought was being interrupted. What on earth was that noise? Suddenly he was wide awake. His nerves were jangling. Whatever that noise was, it sounded sinister. He pushed himself up onto his knees. He peered over the edge of the nest. He shook Karen's shoulder when he saw. It gave him a fright. He shook her roughly and her sleepy face emerged from beneath the cardigan. What's the matter? Breakfast time? She mumbled. Andy pointed downwards and she knelt up quickly and looked over the ledge. Way down, halfway between the nest and the rocks below, was a thing, a creature. The strangest creature the children had ever seen. It certainly was not in any history books that they knew of. It was about as big as a fully grown elephant, and it did in fact have a trunk like an elephant, except that it was much longer and completely pink and strangely translucent, see-through. The head was quite comical, with two almost human ears on each side and big bright twinkling eyes. Just below the trunk was a small cupid bow mouth that was bright red and looked as though it was painted on by lipstick, and from the mouth jutted two white and pointed teeth. The body looked completely round, an enormous ball of bright orange-coloured hair. But strangest of all were the creature's feet. They were like large, upside-down soup bowls, black and shiny and stuck on the end of incredibly spindly legs. The animal was plodding very slowly up the vertical face of the cliff, and with every step it took, it would hold out its foot to its mouth, shoot out a long tongue, lick the sole very thoroughly, and then it would press the foot firmly against the rock face. And the last action made a very loud noise. "Prepare to repel boarders," yelled Karen. She stopped and picked up the last remaining pterodactyl's egg and staggered to the edge of the nest with it. "Hang on, not yet." Andy held out his arm to stop her, heaving the egg over the edge. "Wait until it's a bit nearer, you might miss." So they balanced the egg on a stout branch and waited. The curious creature plodded upwards towards, licking its feet as it did so until it was only about 2 meters away. "Take aim," said Andy. Steady, right, fire!" Karen pushed the egg and it plunged dead on target towards the strange creature's face. The little painted mouth suddenly became a gaping hole. The egg went straight in without touching the sides and disappeared like a bucket going down a well. There was a soft plopping noise and the mouth closed up again into its little rosebud smile. The creature was now level with the nest. The children, goggle-eyed, cringed against the back of the nest, sure it was the end that was now near. It leant its huge body against the side of the nest and stretched out its long tongue towards Karen's face. She shut her eyes, too exhausted to fight any more, and waited for the sharp teeth to sink into her flesh. Two soft lips touched her cheek. There was a long, gurgling noise, a bit like a bath emptying, followed by a wet, popping noise. It was the sloppiest, wettest kiss she'd ever received. She opened her eyes and stared at the creature in astonishment. It looked down at her, nodding its head, licking its lips and smiling at her in the most friendly fashion, not in the least bit aggressively. Andy still had his eyes squeezed shut and an agonised expression on his face. Karen nudged him in the ribs and pointed at the great, beaming face that now loomed over them. "It kissed me," she said. Andy didn't answer. He just stared up at the monster. "It kissed me," repeated Karen. And here you can see Bunjee. The big see-through trunk, a ball of orange hair, spindly legs with suckers. He's got a little rosebud mouth and quite a friendly looking face. The monster lifted its head and pointed the long translucent trunk straight upwards. The mouth opened and from it came a deep gravelly croaking noise. "Eep, eep, eep, Bunjee!" It leant forward again and gave Andy a juicy wet kiss on the forehead, then threw its head back again and croaked even louder. "Wara, wara, wara, eep, eep, Bunjee!" I think it wants to be friendly, Karen whispered. She leant forward, tentatively, and touched the creature's trunk. "Hello?" she said. Good boy, as though she was addressing a dog. The huge head turned to one side. It seemed to be listening attentively. It opened the small red mouth, and once again the curious croaking noise came rumbling up from the cavernous depths of the great round body. "Eep, eep, good boy," it boomed, and again it gave her a wet kiss on the face. "It is friendly," shouted Andy, and he jumped to his feet with relief. "Eep, eep, wara, friendly, Bunjee," it said. Andy patted the long trunk and smiled up at the big cheerful face. "You had us worried for a while. We thought we were going to get eaten." "Go get eating." It smiled and looked backward and forward between the two children, making little clucking noises at the back of its throat and looking as though it was going to kiss them at any minute. "You're quite a mimic, aren't you, old chap?" said Karen. "You sound as though you're trying to copy everything we say." Andy nodded. "Yeah, he's a bit like a huge hairy myna bird." "Eep, eep, mine a bird," the strange animal croaked. No, said Andy. "Myna bird." No, myna bird," came the answer. Well, the children sat back in the nest and hooted with laughter. They roared, clutching their sides, tears streaming down their cheeks, allowing the tensions of the past few hours to flow out and away, happy to have met one creature at least that wasn't after them for food. In fact, so excited were they at meeting this friendly ball of orange hair and all thoughts of their thirst and their predicament were temporarily forgotten. The next 15 minutes or so were spent saying words to the huge hairy animal, which he immediately mimicked. He seemed to relish each word, rolling it around his tongue before saying it and smiling happily when the children praised him for getting it right. The game went on, and surprisingly with each new word, the big friendly creature's pronunciation became better and better. It became increasingly evident to Karen and Andy that here was no ordinary animal, but an animal with a keen intelligence. At times, when there was a lull in the flow of words and the children sat just quietly, he would lean forward and say anxiously, "More," or even string two words that he'd heard together and say, "More, please." He never left any gap between the words and said everything in a rush, as though if he didn't get them out of his mouth quickly enough, he'd just forget them. It was quite extraordinary. After 2 more hours, every word of conversation that passed between the two children was picked up and seemingly stored away in a filing cabinet up in that large hairy head. He retained everything. He put words together at first hesitantly and then with increasing confidence, like a good student of a foreign language. Occasionally he'd throw his head back in the air and let out the piercing "eep, eep, eep, wara, Bunjee" noise, and then lean forward as though nothing had happened and say, "What's the next word then?" "This is fantastic." Andy scratched his head and looked at his sister. "If we had gone forward in time instead of backwards, I'd have expected to discover a superintelligence. But we've travelled millions of years backwards in time, and where all the creatures, according to our teacher, were supposed to be small-brained. Gosh, won't we have something to tell them when we get back? This should alter the history books." "This'll alter the history books," beamed the big hairy face. "If we get back," said Karen dismally. "We're still no better off than when the pterodactyl brought us up here for her supper." She stood up and looked down at the terrifying drop to the rocks below. At this, their new friend wagged his trunk and looked from side to side, scanning the cliff wall quickly with his little eyes. "Where's the pterodactyl then?" he said, a frown of concentration creasing his forehead. "Pardon?" stammered Andy. "I think he said, 'Where's the pterodactyl then?'" said Carrie. Oh, said Andy, speaking slowly, still unable to believe that this creature could understand. We threw eggs at it and it fell into the river." The creature screwed up its eyes as it strived to work out the meaning of Andy's words, blinked twice and then said, "What a pity, what a pity." "Oh dear," said Karen. "I'm sorry. Was it your friend?" The huge bulk suddenly started shaking with laughter until it looked as though it would shake its suction cups loose and fall off the wall. Let me just show you what it says next. That's how it's written in the book. I'll pull that further forward. It says, I can't see actually, it's sunny. I'll best leave it like that. It says, "Pterodactyls don't have friends. Pterodactyls don't have friends." There's a little bit rubbed off, I have to say, because, can I just show you that? That is Neil, as I'm getting ready to do this and writing on the board. My cat was trying to rub it off, so you'll have to excuse. I'm trying to do my best. Okay. "Pterodactyls don't have friends." He laughed, wiping a tear from his eye with the end of his trunk. No. You see that bit? No, I meant, what a pity about the eggs. It took the children some time to work this last one out, but at last they understood. No, I meant, what a pity about the eggs. Oh, I see, said Andy. You like eating pterodactyls' eggs? Love 'em, was the reply. It closed its eyes in rapture. Yummy. Oh dear, we're sorry if we've thrown away your dinner. But we had to protect ourselves, or we would have been eaten. Doesn't matter. It paused, searching for words, then eep. Plenty more nests about. Andy groaned and held his stomach. Oh, please don't talk about food, he said. I haven't eaten for so long, I'm starving. He put his hands to his ears as the creature suddenly shrieked, Eep, wara, Bunjee. I've got an idea, Karen said, her ears still ringing from the noise. She pointed over the edge of the nest at the ground far below and, speaking very slowly and clearly, said, Do you think you could carry us down to the ground? The little eyes looked down at the direction of Karen's finger, then up to Karen's face, then across to Andy's face, then up at the cliff. A big smile spread across its face and it said, Eep, jump at the back. Hang on a minute, said Andy, blurted out nervously. Will your feet stick to the wall with all of our weight? It put its head between its legs and looked at the ground again, then shook its head. Not going to climb, going to fly. What do you mean, said the children, suddenly afraid again. How could it fly? After all, the thing didn't have any wings. Maybe they hadn't heard properly. Jump at the back, the thing repeated. Well, what have we got to lose? Shrugged Andy, climbing over the edge of the nest and clinging to the bright orange hair on the creature's back. If we don't get off this ledge soon, we're going to starve anyway. Karen nodded and joined him, her eyes tightly shut with fear. "Here we go!" it cried. "Eep, eep, warra, 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 Bunjee!" Suddenly, it pointed its long trunk straight into the air. The snout tip closed tightly like a fist, and the creature started to blow into its trunk. It started to swell and get bigger. The little mouth opened and shut, sucking in great quantities of air and forcing it up into the trunk. And soon above them, the trunk was transformed into a massive balloon, which looked as though it would burst at any minute. Little pink veins crisscrossed in a fine lattice work all over the ever-swelling globe, and the flesh had become so stretched it had become even more transparent. There were 4 soft popping noises as the great hairy animal detached its feet from the wall, and then slowly they started to drift away from the ledge and out into space. Once away from the ledge, the creature started to let small amounts of air escape from its trunk, and gradually they started to descend. Can you imagine? The air came out in a high-pitched, spluttering shriek, making the same kind of noise that a balloon makes when the neck is pinched and stretched in the fingers. It was a bit frightening at first. Andy started to worry that the thing might have loose hair and dandruff problems like his dad had, and that he'd plunge to his death clutching handfuls of hair. But his fear turned into excitement as they got lower and started to sweep in over the treetops like a helicopter. Down there, he could see that the tiny little river that he'd seen from the ledge was, on closer inspection, a raging torrent of a river. The little bushes were actually huge, thick conifers, and the pebbles became enormous rocks. They floated down along the path of the river and landed gently on a mossy bank. The water at this point had formed a still pool, and they were some way away from the deafening roar of the main river. "That was super," said Karen enthusiastically. "Thank you very much, Mr. Please, what shall we call you? What's your name?" "Eep, eep, I'm a Bunjee," it said, its head bobbing up and down. And there we'll leave it. We're partway through chapter 7 and we'll finish that off very soon. Thanks for listening. Bye now.